everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Two Idiots Podcast. I'm Reg.
I'm Randy.
And joining us this week from across the pond in the United Kingdom is Joanna Jolly? Jolly?
Jolly.
Okay. Last names are not my thing.
That's okay.
I'm so bad for it. Anyway, so you mentioned earlier, but whereabouts in the UK are you coming in from?
Okay, so I'm in a county called Wiltshire, which is west of London and is famous for Stonehenge, which is just down the road from me.
Nice.
And the city of Bath is quite nearby, and also the city of Salisbury, where the poisonings took place, the Russian poisoning. But
Wow,
mostly I'm kind of in the countryside near Stonehenge.
Nice. It's quite the trifecta.
It's gotta be kind of neat to have a big, world-renowned monument like that close to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. We've also got the Avebury Stone Circle, which isn't very far away. And there's this ancient sort of mound, sort of 4,500-year-old mound called Silbury Hill, which is also a big sort of religious site. And this is where the ley lines are. We're not too far from Glastonbury. It's the old kind
That's
of...
That's where that church is, right? The Glastonbury Tor or whatever?
Yeah, Glastonbury Tor, that's right, yeah. And it's kind of... supposedly sort of significant for King Arthur. So this is kind of the area with a lot of myth and legend in, and I love it for that, actually.
That's amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, my wife and I were in the UK a couple years ago, and I purposely avoided Stonehenge because everybody told me that you can't even get that close, and it's just crowded, and there's a highway nearby, and it kind of sucks. So we went to drawing a blank on the name. It's basically an older, larger ring of multiple rings of stones with like a town in the middle of it. I forget the name of it.
Avebury. That would have been Avebury, I think.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, that's just down the road from here.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. So we did that instead. Stepping around sheep poop, but anyway, that's neither here nor there.
There's a lot of that there.
Yeah. So let's maybe tell our listeners something about you. I mean, we have you here because you wrote a book about a local murder, but tell us something more broadly about you.
Okay, so I'm a writer and a journalist. I've been a journalist really for all of my career, apart from 1 year I spent teaching. I spent a lot of that time working for the BBC, but not all of it. And I'm sort of now back with the BBC doing some podcasts, actually, so a bit like you. Cool. But I was for a very long time an Asia specialist and lived all throughout Asia, but in particular in India and Nepal. I'm half Indian, and so that kind of led to that interest. My dad is from India.
Okay.
And I spent 3 years in East Timor, covering the sort of struggle for independence and the sort of war that took place there and the aftermath, which was like probably the kind of big seminal thing I did, when I was a young journalist, and I absolutely loved it. And I also lived in Australia for a while, in Japan, and I also have been in Washington as well, and in South Africa and Brussels and Jerusalem. So I've been all over the place, really.
No kidding.
And now I live in Wiltshire, so kind of quite a difference.
The list might have been shorter to say where you have not been.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but no, that's amazing. Quite frankly, I'm jealous of seeing many of those places. But as a reporter in possibly contentious situations, how do you navigate that? Like, what's that like?
But what do you mean by contentious? You mean like dangerous, or?
Well, sure. Yeah, if that ever came up, especially if you're dealing with possible, independence fights or anything like that. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, when I first was in that situation, I had no hostile environment training or anything like that. And you just got very good very quickly at spotting the signs of trouble, like knowing what time of the day the trouble would take place. So we used to call sort of 4 o'clock onwards, we'd call it the witching hour, because what would happen was at the time in East Timor, I'm talking about, there were a lot of militia, and they would kind of sleep most of the day, and then they'd wake up in the afternoon and start getting drunk and they'd take a kind of speed like drug. So we knew they'd be roaming the streets from about 4 o'clock. So you kind of knew that if you wanted to be safe, you needed to be kind of somewhere that you could stay after that time, and stuff like that. You just get quite quick at learning sort of safety stuff. But then when I joined the BBC later on, I had a lot of training in, they're quite good at training you to cope in hostile environments like that.
Wow.
So, and also to deal with hostile people, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Which we could probably all use a little bit.
Useful, definitely.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. So clearly you've been to Canada, I assume, at least to do some of your reporting for Red River Girl, which is, part of the reason why you're here. I'm curious, what's your impressions of Winnipeg? What was your first thought, if you remember, when you first saw the city?
So the first time I saw Winnipeg was when I came. It was in January 2015 when I came to do the original BBC report, Red River Women, which then became Red River Girl in the books. I'd flown out from Washington, D.C., where I was based at the time. So, it was snowy, but so was Washington. So that wasn't like, what was my first thought about Winnipeg? It's really hard to remember back. I was quite impressed with the center of Winnipeg, I remember, and I thought the Exchange District was really beautiful. But I guess, the story I was covering was really bleak. And to me there was a real sense of bleakness to the place. I guess I was there in mid-January, or at the end of January, so
yeah,
it's pretty you know what it's like at that time.
Yeah.
I remember at the time there was a kind of warm snap. It was like -5, and the people we were interviewing didn't have hats on, and I was like, oh my god, you must be so cold. But they were like, no, this is really warm for us.
T-shirt and shorts weather right there.
Yeah. Almost. I found that quite kind of remarkable. But yeah, I suppose the first few days I was there, I was just working so hard, trying to get interviews and get from place to place and stuff. So it took me a while to really form an impression of Winnipeg. And I have to say, so I went back several times, and quite a few times actually, and I've got a good friend who lives there, so I quite often stay with her, a British friend who's emigrated out there. And then finally, I went back to cover the trial, Raymond Cormier's trial. And I was there for the trial, and then the sort of probably about 4 months afterwards, I stayed on to research. And I saw winter turn into spring, very quick spring that you have, and then into summer. And I really developed a real affection for Winnipeg at that point. I felt like I'd been through the worst, and I could really appreciate the beauty of Winnipeg and all the stuff that. And the one thing I really liked about Winnipeg was that. And this is a very British thing, but in Britain, London is like everything. London is our major city, and everything gravitates to London. And so, for many years I lived in London, and you have to kind of live in London, and that means you have to live in a kind of small flat, and you have to commute all the time by tube, and the whole thing is just kind of exhausting. And when I was in Winnipeg, I really appreciated that people lived in neighborhoods that had parks, and that, when it was warm enough, kids were out playing in the parks, and you could walk to your local kind of neighborhood shops, and there'd be nice restaurants there. And the whole thing was just really geared up for families and for living a nice, good life. And okay, you didn't have, all the amazing stuff that London or any big city has in that, in that kind of way big cities have that stuff. But what you did have was a really good quality of life. And the other thing I really remembered was, for a while, so I kind of moved around from Airbnb to Airbnb. I think I stayed in every Airbnb that's available in Winnipeg. So one of them was, I tried to live around Osborne Village because that's where my friend was living, and obviously I wanted to be close to her.
It's a great spot.
And also it was a really convenient spot, and it's a great spot. I really liked it there. But one time I was in the CBD. I don't know why, I can't remember where I was staying exactly. And I remember wanting to walk to Safeways in Osborne to buy some food, and it was 5 o'clock in the hour, or 6 o'clock in the evening, and it was still light, and there was no traffic. And I was like, this is crazy, because in London between the hours of 4 and 8 it is absolutely gridlocked. And the idea that most people would have got home by that stage and be having their supper and going out in the evening just kind of blew my mind. And I know that sounds really odd, but I really appreciated what kind of city Winnipeg was. And my British friend who lived there, who's emigrated out there, absolutely loves it, and has a really good quality of life. So I really appreciate that.
That's an amazing.
I feel that's kind of the way it is with Winnipeg. Is that like it kind of gets like a bleak and dreary rap if you haven't been there. It's got like a blue collar worker vibe kind of city, but when you do get into it and you spend some time, you really do get to see that it is, quite a nice city with a lot of different features to it, right? With all the different sections of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And pretty as well. Pretty because you can walk along the river. So every single day I'd walk along the river because, to me, the river was everything, obviously, with the book. And I really just, there's a point when you're writing, you always need to walk a lot when you're writing to kind of gather your thoughts and let things percolate through your brain.
Yeah.
And I absolutely loved that walk. And I, especially loved it when I could walk on the river when it was frozen and in the beautiful, beautiful sunshine. That's one thing we don't have in England is that absolutely kind of like eye-blinding white snow sunshine days, that strong
right.
And when they had the ice sculptures and they had all that fun stuff on the I wasn't on the red. Assiniboine, that was what I was on. Sorry, it's been a while. And then you walk into the red, and you can do these long walks. It was brilliant. I mean, I didn't skate. I wish I'd tried it, but I didn't. I just wasn't that organised. But
that's
but yeah,
amazing.
all of that I really appreciated. So and then of course the flatness. I mean, and this. So I had to drive to Brandon quite a few times for this book to interview various people in Brandon. That seemed to be the place I always needed to be, and also up to Saugeen, but. In a way, Saugeen was a bit more rolling, the hills, the landscape. Yeah. But when I went to Brandon, there's one hill you go up, but the flatness just blew my mind. I mean, it was just crazy.
Yeah, the further north you go, it gets real pretty and real nice. But yeah, that 3-hour stretch between Winnipeg and Brandon, boy, that's a fall asleep kind of drive.
Yeah, I did it once. The first time I did it, well, I did it once in the middle of the night when I interviewed Cormier in prison. But the first time I kind of did it during the daytime was there was hoarfrost on the trees and it was so beautiful. But again, I'm such easy driving compared to England, so I drive on these country roads which are so my Canadian friends, actually my friend who's married to a Canadian guy from Winnipeg, they came over here and went on a driving holiday down to the Cornwall and Devon, and they really struggled on the roads.
Yeah.
And they were like,
I did it one time.
How do you drive on these roads?
Never again.
And I'm like, how do you stay awake on your road? It's so boring.
It's a real struggle. It's actually a thing that you'll see people in the ditch because they have fallen asleep.
Oh my goodness. God.
It's especially, I did it for one afternoon driving in the UK, and I will never do it again. I just about freaked out. My wife was beside me, like having a panic attack the whole time, and I'm like white knuckling it, and I'm forgetting to shift and trying to like not hit the curb or hit the hedges, and then there's buses coming around blind corners that nobody knows. It's terrifying.
And tractors and
yeah. The highway was okay, but the rest of it was not. We drove all the way to Bath, and then from Bath back to I think was it Southampton? Oh, I don't remember where I got the car from, but either way, it was once it was dark on the highway, it was easier. But once I could see how close I was to everything, it was terrifying. Driving
it is.
definitely easier.
I think the driving here is mental. Actually, I mean, every day I'm on the country roads thinking this is really hard.
There's no room.
What's going to come.
There's no give. It's just you're just about to slam into everybody, but nobody does. It's interesting.
Sounds exhilarating.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I like it.
I said exactly that it's like a video game, but if you mess up, you die.
No pressure.
Yeah.
It was a great experience, but not something I want to do again. But yeah, that said, I'm actually kind of glad for your description of Winnipeg and kind of Manitoba. It's an interesting kind of refreshing view of the city that, frankly, a lot of us shit on, if we're being honest. But there is a really strong sense of pride and community, and like this might be a shithole, but it's our shithole, and it's sort of like a blue collar type of.
It's the working class, like we're all kind of in it together, sort of thing.
Yeah, and while at the same time we can acknowledge it. Yeah, but it is kind of bleak, especially in January. It's
The thing that made me laugh the most was so I warmed to during the trial, and after that was the time I kind of really warmed to Winnipeg. And I remember speaking to a producer back over in Toronto who'd never been to Winnipeg, a Canadian producer, and he said to me, you know, every time I think of Winnipeg, I just shake my head, and I just thought that was really unfair.
Yeah,
He said, it's not that bad. You should do it. It's great.
and frankly, most Manitobans shake their head when they think of Toronto, so it's kind of
no, it's
quid
a
pro quo.
rivalry thing. Okay.
Yeah. The one description you had for sure in the book, I think it was near the beginning when you're talking about, I think it was late spring, and you kind of described our piles of like dirty colored snow slush after the streets are cleared.
I did become rather obsessed by them. Yeah.
Yeah. It was very, very, very accurate, and I don't know, it made me dread winter, but it was very realistic. Anyway.
Yeah,
so let's.
And there's always that sort of stage when the snow melts and then refreezes, and your ankles get broken. I'm sure a lot just walking along sidewalks because it's so hazardous. I don't know how.
More so tailbones, not so many ankles, but a lot of people fall and hurt their elbows and hurt their butts.
Yeah,
so
for sure,
it's
I totally believe that.
It's a real treacherous place sometimes, but it has its charm.
We love it. We love it.
Yeah, no, I can see that very much. Yeah.
In spite of itself. So speaking of its darker side, clearly Red River Girl highlights that. So frankly, a little backwards. So this was 2014 when they found her body. I didn't know anything about it. I grew up around here. I heard the name. I recognized the name. But for whatever reason, I was in my own privileged little bubble that it never even really occurred to me. We live about 45 minutes south of Winnipeg. But regardless, I'm in Winnipeg every day, and for whatever reason, it just never permeated my my own bubble. So when I finally got to it, I was reading the book, and it just, I don't know, it hit me. I'm very glad that you wrote it. It's the mixture of like local streets that I'm aware of and place names and I can picture myself there while it's happening,
close to home
with these
for
people.
sure.
Yeah, it really hit me, and it kind of, again, it made me aware of the fact that I did have the privilege that I could be so removed from it. So maybe tell us how you came across the story, kind of what inspired you to write it, and kind of how that process went.
Yeah, what drew you to it for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, just let me take a sip of tea if that's okay. Sorry.
Sure.
I am.
Have at it.
I was going to say, you're in the UK, and I think you have to drink tea. Isn't that a law?
I do have to drink tea. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So what happened was, so it was all completely, not planned in any way. So I was the BBC South Asia editor. I'd been working on Asia, and particularly South Asia, for a very long time. And then suddenly, out of the blue, this opportunity came to go to Washington to do a bit of writing, to be the feature writer. And
like DC.
I applied for it and got it, and knew nothing really about North America. And in fact, the day I flew out to Washington, it so happened that one of my colleagues, who wasn't at the BBC but was another journalist, was flying back to India, and we met up for brunch at Heathrow. Yeah. And I said to her, God, it's the first time I've ever flown west and not east. I can't, it was so new to me. And she's like, how exciting. And I was like, oh, I wish I was going to India, because I just didn't know what to expect on the other side. But I arrived in Washington, and I arrived sort of a couple of weeks before Tina's body was found. So one, she was missing, actually. And I didn't know anything about it. And then every day we had editorial meetings in my job in the BBC in Washington. And I had a Canadian colleague, and we were in this editorial meeting. It must have been August the 18th, the day after Tina was found. And 2014, and we all had to sort of give a story idea. And my Canadian colleague said, there's been another murder in Canada. Canadians are so racist. And this just caught my imagination, because I thought, I really have written a lot about racism and experienced racism and all the sort of things around the world. And I had never thought of, in fact, we are pretty much told that Canadians are not racist. It's kind of almost like it's a mantra that's said about Canada, that everything that's wrong with the world, go to Canada. Canada is the place where everything works, especially when it comes to multiculturalism and the melting pot. Well, you don't have a melting pot, do you?
We're a cultural mosaic.
Cultural mosaic, that's right. And and certainly you've got really great policies when it comes to refugees and people like, for instance, Syrian, which, I admire hugely. So I was just really my imagination was caught by this. I went off and I had a bit of time, so I started Googling and found out that this was a big problem. Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls was a huge problem, and was frankly quite amazed because I've worked in news at that point, for over 15 years, and I just thought, in general news as well, and it was a story I hadn't come across. And I'd worked also a lot on violence against women and had covered in particular rape in India. There was a big rape case in 2012, which was very famous or notorious, I should say. And had sort of specialized on that in a way, specialized in covering sexual violence. So I had, I was just really surprised. And with that sort of enthusiasm, when you come across a new subject, you think, oh God, I just want to learn everything I possibly can about this.
Yeah.
And I'm saying these words like enthusiasm and stuff, which are kind of not quite congruent with the subject matter. But I was just frankly amazed at that there was this thing going on in this country, there was a real disconnect really between my understanding of Canada, which of course was completely skin deep, and a tourist's understanding of Canada, and the reality of this particular issue. So I then tried to kind of get my editors interested in doing a story, and frankly they weren't interested. So sort of long period passed, and then the second girl was attacked, whose name actually can't be used or broadcast anymore. And survived. And at that point I thought, and the coincidence of the river and the second attack and Tina's body being found in the river just seemed, too much in a way. And I started researching more and more. And at that point I managed to get hold of the Winnipeg police, which was really difficult. I can't tell you how hard it was even to just kind of get through to them and get through to the homicide unit. Mm-hmm. But I managed to get through to Danny Smythe, who I think is now the chief of police. He was last time I kind of checked, but he was a deputy at the time, and had this really good conversation with him and said, look, I'm really interested in coming. I'm interested in doing a radio documentary and writing a long piece about this. And he was super, super friendly and super helpful. And then suddenly, just after that phone call, I just could not get hold of him again. And I rang and I left messages, and I was like this really crazed stalker ringing him all the time. Sometimes I'd be angry. I'd be like, Danny, I thought we had something. And sometimes I'd be like, hey, Danny, Christmas, talk to me. And finally, after him not talking to me for a very long time, he did finally crack, and he spoke to me, and he said, look, one of the reasons we didn't speak to you, because originally I thought instead of coming and covering Tina's case because it was still ongoing, and that threw up a lot of issues, particularly in Britain, where we have very, very strict rules on reporting, which I don't think you really do in the US and Canada, but we always have to abide by the British laws. I wanted to report on a cold case. And finally, Danny sort of said to me, look, the problem with that cold case is that it's actually under investigation again, because there's been another confession in it. It was the Sean Lamb case, which you probably, I mentioned it very briefly. He
sounds
killed
vaguely
2
familiar.
women. But he said, I'll put you in touch with Sergeant Joanna Donovan, who's the head of homicide. And I spoke to him, and he said, come along, we'll just do some stuff on Tina's case, we'll make it work, and we'll give you a ride along. It was all great. So I turned up with my fantastic team from Washington, and we were there for 5 days and made Red River Women. And then after Red River Women came out, which it did sort of a few months later, then there was interest in a book, and that was a kind of slow growing interest. And I was never really convinced there was going to be a book until finally, in fact, for a long time, there probably wasn't going to be a book. And then Sergeant O'Donovan rang me out of the blue in December that year and said, we've arrested somebody. And why don't you come to Winnipeg and I'll tell you more about it? And I was in Boston, luckily, at the time, so not too far away. And so I flew up to Winnipeg, and he said, look, we did this extraordinary investigation, and I'm willing to give you the notes to it. So I thought, okay, so finally I have something I can write a book about. So that's how
amazing.
It came about.
Excellent.
That's really interesting, especially your perspective of Canada, because I don't think it's necessarily even a tourist view, or not exclusively a tourist view, because frankly, a lot of people around here have the same sort of perspective without doing any digging sort of into what is going on. It's easy to say Canadians are polite and we're delightful and we don't pick fights and we're wonderful.
You're all those things.
Yeah, but exactly.
There's also this dark underbelly.
Yeah, Canada's really good at sweeping a lot of that stuff under the rug when it comes to public image.
Yeah, and it's definitely starting to get better. But for a long time, that was sort of our stereotype. And it's not necessarily wrong, but there's more to it. And I'm glad that it's starting to flip, especially with like Black Lives Matter and a lot of the police brutality stuff that's been rampant across the world. It's really shining a light on a lot of the inequities and the issues within Canada, because there's a huge issue between whether it's Winnipeg police, RCMP, just law enforcement in general, against Indigenous and people of color. Mm-hmm. So it's a huge thing. So I'm not surprised that that's how you felt about Canada, but I am glad that the story like this, glad might not be the right word, but I am glad that this story came out, because it does kind of highlight the underbelly, like you said, and it kind of shows to the locals that there's more to it, and we need to be aware, and we need to do better.
Oh, and that's the thing. The only way to really fix these things is to make people aware of them, right? As hard as they are to hear, it's necessary for people to realize what's going on and to actually do something about it.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the book is so the book has two publishers. There's a publisher in Canada, which is also in the US, and there's a publisher over here which also publishes in lots of other countries, pretty much the rest of the world. And I just really wanted this book to be a book that lots of people who knew nothing about the subject would read and go, "Oh, I had no idea."
Yeah.
So it's kind of a book for probably less for people who already know about the subject and more for people who've never heard about it before. I mean, I found the whole story absolutely extraordinary, really.
It is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Quite heartbreaking. I mean, immensely heartbreaking. And really important. It's just a really important story to tell.
Oh, for sure.
And yeah.
And especially one of the things that stood out to me while I was reading the book was the statistics of domestic abuse in general versus domestic abuse against Indigenous women. And I forget the exact breakdown, but it's basically more Indigenous women are attacked by people they don't know, as opposed to most non-Indigenous people are attacked by people they know. So that means, based on that, is that they're being attacked by just random, hatred and happenstance and just maybe apathy, whereas most people are attacked by people they know, which it's not great. In no way am I condoning any of that, but it was just it really hit me that they're affected disproportionately by just strangers. We need to do better as a society, as a community. It's truly traumatic. I couldn't believe it. I
mean, there's a real sense of disposability, really, about women and girls in that situation. And I think one of my interviewees said it very well, Bernadette Smith, when she said that people think that nobody cares about Indigenous women, but we do care. We are here. We do care. But if you think about, for a long time, and Project to Vote that was set up by a sort of jointly between the RCMP and the Winnipeg Police Force, looking into cold cases, the majority of which, or who were Indigenous victims, and who at the time their murders or disappearances weren't investigated thoroughly, or as thoroughly as they would have been if they were a kind of white girl going missing in Osborne or in Osborne Village. That would have had a much higher exposure and a much higher sort of amount of publicity around it, and pressure therefore on the police to do more. I think, obviously, I do really think that has changed with Tina. Yeah. And I do think Tina was the change, the point of the catalyst, of pivoting, the point of change. Yeah. Because I think at that point it was just so bad, it couldn't continue in that way. But I mean, interestingly, we've just had the death of the Yorkshire Ripper here. I don't know if you're aware of this serial. No. We had a serial murder here in the UK in the 70s and 80s, actually, and possibly even murdering from the 60s, and possibly, I mean, he's known to have murdered 13 women, but he possibly, his death count could have been twice that, because there's a lot that is still not known. And one of the reasons there was a real bodged police investigation to find him, and one of the reasons behind that was that a lot of the victims were sex workers, and also there was this really entrenched misogyny in the police at the time that meant that they, even though that, by the sort of, 10th victim, they really were investigating it very thoroughly. They had preconceptions and ideas about women that meant that they didn't really, this guy looked like a nice family guy. So they brought him in to be interviewed countless times and never followed up on their suspicions.
Wow.
So it's to do with a kind of, innate prejudice that was held at the time. And it was a very, at one point, I think what happened was the killer sort of graduated from killing sex workers to killing students and just normal women, as the police would have said at the time.
Right.
And the head of police said something like, look, some of us can understand what you're doing when you're killing prostitutes, but come on, now you're killing innocent women who haven't done anything. There was a real sense that there were deserving victims and undeserving victims, and I think that the issue of Indigenous women in Canada sort of straddles the same area, that there's this idea that Indigenous women are kind of inevitable victims in a way because of lifestyle choices, which again are not choices in the majority of cases, but people are forced into them because there really isn't much of an option.
Yeah, exactly. And they clearly, most of them aren't choosing that life, but it's been chosen for them for over decades and generations of trauma. But that kind of reminds me, I was going to bring up, there's a podcast I've been listening to recently from the CBC, and they were talking about a guy who was wrongfully convicted of killing his ex-girlfriend, who was also a sex worker, and it was a similar thing where it was in Halifax and Dartmouth, basically where there was kind of areas in which prostitutes would normally work, and they were dying disproportionately or disappearing, and there was no investigations, or virtually none. There was very, oh well, they're gone. What are you going to do? And then this one died. They accused him, even though there were other suspects that they didn't even look into. Some of the evidence was based on a psychic, and it became a whole thing. And so then he spent 19 or 21 years or something in jail for a crime that he didn't do. But it's a similar thing where, and people were looking into it years earlier, but the cops were like, no, we got the guy. It's done. Because he was also a bit of a shady guy. So it's sort of similar where it's, you're in this camp, so clearly you're not worth respecting or listening to or acknowledging. So just throw the book at him and close the door, move on with your day. But you're absolutely right. If it was white kids, or like you say, students, or in any other way, quote, valuable people, right? It's disgusting. But it happens everywhere.
It does happen everywhere. It makes us look at our justice systems and the sort of innate prejudice within them. Mm-hmm. And and it kind of lots to think about now.
Yeah, and again, books like this and stories like this. I mean, Tina has no way of knowing the impact that her story will have ended up having. But I consider her, I guess, a hero. I mean, after the fact, of course. But I'm glad that this is now brought forward. And again, a lot of people chafe at the thought, and they get really annoyed, and why do we have to keep talking about this, and why is it all about race, and why is it all this, and why is it all that? And frankly, I ignore those people because it's hardly worth mentioning, because we need to have more honest discussions about these types of things. And your book did an amazing job of that. And I've been promoting it pretty heavily to friends of mine, and
for sure,
I want more and more people to read it because it's local, and then by reading that, they can then broaden it to see that it's national, to see that it's international, to see that it's worse and worse and worse.
Like even for my wife Darius, like she had read it for her book club, and she had said that she's been living here for the last 7 years. She's from Ontario originally, and she said like she read it and she's like, I had no idea that like anything like this was happening in Winnipeg, because she's only ever really seen like the Kenaston, St. Patel areas, right? And doesn't know much about the history of it, so she's just like, I can't believe that this is actually happening in this city and so close to us.
Yeah.
I find that, yeah, wow, that's quite amazing. I mean, one of the things I did find amazing about Winnipeg, and this is again a sort of coming from London perspective, is that you have this area in the North End, which is pretty much a no-go area for a lot of people, but which is right in the center of the city, which, you know, in a city like London, which space is a premium, that would never happen. It would be some, you know, the developers would be in there in a shot, you know, it would all be gentrified. And I found that really weird. And I would spend a lot of time walking around the North End and just be amazed at really how, like, there really weren't many people walking around the North End unless you belong there.
Yeah. And, what was that like? What was your experience like wandering around? Because frankly, I drive through it quite a lot for work, but I've never actively just strolled through. That's just not a thing that you do here. So I'm curious what your...
No, I can understand why, because I walked up from what street am I on? The one going up. I guess it's Main, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Main Street.
And then you walk up under this underpass.
Yeah.
I write about it, and it's got the Turtle Mountain Lodge just there, and the Salvation Army. It's scary going under that underpass on your own. And there was a certain point where I was like, is this wise? Like, because you are quite, it is, I mean, it's quite a vulnerable place. Any underpass is a vulnerable place to be, but it felt vulnerable there. And then walking up and down the streets, I mean, obviously I did it in broad daylight. But yeah, you feel vulnerable because it's a different place. It doesn't have the same rules as the center of the city, CBD area. There are the sort of the boarded up hotels with the chicken wire around them, and where people go to get high, I guess, and to drink sometimes, and people also live there, I guess, using social security checks. They, you know, if you don't belong to that scene, it's intimidating from the outside. But also, I felt for the people who were there, because I could see a lot of illness, I could see a lot of disability, obviously a lot of poverty. It felt like it felt a pretty desperate place. Though, having said that, I also noted that there was a really good sense of community activism going on, and you know, the sort of walking around guys that the Bear Patrol, who I don't know, who wandered around. They were fantastic. I went out with them a couple of times. The police also patrol it quite thoroughly. But there are also a lot of charitable organizations and kind of NGO type organizations there working very hard, and a good sense of community in that way. People talked about the sense of community, but yeah, it definitely a deprived area.
Yeah. We recently had James Favell on, who was kind of spurred to kickstart the Bear Clan Patrol again because of the Tina Fontaine murders.
He's doing a fantastic job. I thought he was great to talk to and full of enthusiasm, and it's great to see how much impact his project has had as well.
Oh, for sure. And it, again, for a lot of people, especially from where we are, we don't live in Winnipeg, but everybody knows of the North End, and it's mostly...
It's sort of like an unwritten rule to not be in the North End after a certain time of day, right?
Yeah.
I understand that. Yeah. I mean, I probably wouldn't go myself, actually. I mean, I did go on a few night patrols with the police, but obviously that's quite a different different thing.
Even that, frankly, I probably wouldn't, even by myself. And I'm a large white guy, right? Like most spaces are fairly safe for me, but that I probably wouldn't. And I'm glad, after speaking with James and even with your experiences, that there's the community outreach, or that there's the community process and progress, and frankly, I hope that it can continue. But I don't know if the supports are there, or if, you know, the help is actually there enough. But I hope that over time that they can continue to better it.
They've been trying for a long time to kind of rejuvenate downtown and bring I don't even know how to describe it, but like really bolster it and make it like a part of the city that people really want to go to again, right? And get everybody there. But it seems like it's hard to get kind of the rest of Winnipeg to fall in and help these people and
Yeah, I mean,
hope to bring back that prosperity.
it does have to be done very carefully, doesn't it? Because you don't want to just gentrify the area
For
and
sure.
put everybody out. You want it to be an inclusive thing. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's a process.
But I mean, when I think about the North End, I think about Tina running around the North End. You know, she was a kid running around, and she's not the only kid running around the North End. And it's just terrifying, actually, thinking about it.
Oh, absolutely.
She would have come across.
I'm in the same boat, and that's even me now. If I was when I see like when I drive through, yeah, you'll see young kids, boys, girls, whoever, young folks just strolling around. And I can't help but wonder what, are they okay? What, how can we help or what can we do?
Mm-hmm.
It's really stark, especially since most neighborhoods that when you see kids walking around, you're like, oh, off to school or gonna go play in the park or whatever. Right. It's really interesting.
Yeah. There's that added element of danger in that neighborhood. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I guess during the day and they're, it's probably fine. It's just the idea of her, the scene when Tina runs out of the house on 22 Carmen and ends up at the bus stop talking to the guy in the halfway house, the ex-criminal, and then runs off into the night is just like, where the hell does she go at that point?
Exactly. Yeah. I often wonder the same thing when you see people, if they're huddled in a doorway or something. It's like, I've actually actively thought about it. How would you fill your day if you have nowhere to live, you have nowhere to relax, you have nowhere to eat, you have no one to hang out with? You just day by day, you're just trying to live.
You're drifting, basically.
Yeah, but how do you do that, right? Like even when we have free time, I'm in my house. I can watch TV. I can do all these things to kill time. But frankly, how would you wake up when the sun wakes up or whenever you decide to wake up? It's truly a different world, a different life. And again, I'm glad for stories like yours that highlight that people can be more visceral. It's so easy to just group it all together and say that's the North End, just avoid it and it's no problem. Which isn't true. So yeah, I don't know. So frankly, let's get more into the actual writing of the book. So how long did it take? Did you have any issues with, say, editing or publishing or reporting for that type of stuff?
It took, well, I suppose from the moment I wrote Red River Women, the BBC piece, to it being published was about 4 years. And it took a year, probably a year and a half of just nothing but writing, just full-time writing and research. It was it was one of those things where I hadn't written a book before, so I had no idea how hard it was. And I did that thing. Apparently this is really common, that if you get a book commissioned, you spend the first few months telling everyone that I'm writing a book, and you do no work. And inside this fear starts growing, this really intense
anxiety,
fear. And meanwhile you're like, oh, I'm writing a book, and you feel like a terrible fraud and imposter, and that you haven't, it's just a horrible. And luckily I've spoken to other writers who've told me that it's not just me who does this. This is kind of normal. And then there's a sort of crunch point where you realize, okay, I've got to really start writing this book. I can't just talk about it now. There is a deadline. And for me, that came with coming to Winnipeg, going to Winnipeg to cover the trial. So I got there. I actually missed the first few days of the trial, but got there. And as I sat in that trial, it really dawned on me how little I knew about the story I was about to write a book about. Because obviously I had notes from the police, but I didn't. They were heavily redacted, and they were they weren't sort of easy to read. So I kind of dipped in and out of them. I'd spoken to Thelma Fable, Tina's grandma, loads, and her family, and spoken to a lot of other people involved in the story. But it was only when I started sitting through the trial that I realized that there was much I didn't know. And I also realized I could also begin to see that this guilty verdict that I was expecting was not going to happen.
Yeah.
So the trial was really interesting because the prosecution called 46, I think, witnesses. So a huge number of witnesses, and many of them, especially in the first week, were forensic witnesses who said basically there was no forensic evidence, but they had to kind of explain that they went through absolutely everything and tried to test everything. And in the end, and this was really because Tina's body was in the river for too long.
Yeah.
And it washed away the evidence, which I sort of put quite a lot of detail about that into the book, because I do think it's really important, just as the prosecutors found it quite important to say that to the jury. There were a lot of witnesses about that, and then the witnesses moved on to people who saw Tina in her last days, her family, her friends, and then the sort of crew around 22 Carmen and what happened there. And then finally moving on to the undercover operation Project Styx.
Yeah.
So sitting through this, it was quite a long, I think it was about 4 weeks in total, this trial. And every day thinking, gosh, this is not going to go the prosecution's way. This is, this sort of slow realization. And then the sort of, and I've covered a lot of things in my career as a journalist, but covering the day of the verdict was, I think, one of the most dramatically and emotional days I've ever covered, going into the courtroom, this wonderful marble courtroom in the Winnipeg courthouse. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but they have this amazingly large marble courtroom. Apparently it's the largest marble courtroom in North America, in the courthouse.
Wow.
Which is not where the trial took place, actually, but it's where they decided to give the verdict because of the huge amount of public interest. So a lot of people came, and we all were sort of sitting there, and there were a lot of people from the community and leaders from the community all supporting Thelma. And at that point, it was such high drama when Cormier was sort of brought in manacles and shackles, and the jury came in to give their verdict, and they were crying. Many members of the jury were crying when they gave the not guilty verdict, because you could see that they really wanted to give Tina justice.
Yeah.
But really, on the questions that they had to answer, first of all, was it an unlawful killing? And secondly, was Cormier responsible for this unlawful killing? Mm-hmm. They couldn't get a yes on both counts unanimously, clearly. I guess at that point, I realized I would, as a writer, have to go back to basics. So I then spent about a month in the courthouse transcribing the trial, because I think there's a transcription now, but back at the time, a transcription cost about $10,000, which I didn't have.
Wow.
And Winnipeg is not an important enough courthouse to have somebody transcribe all the cases, which to me, again, was like, oh, God, really? And then what was really sort of frustrating about this transcription was I could only work for an hour at a time. You could only book a 1 hour slot, and then you had to go away for an hour, just because they didn't want anyone to hog the transcription room. So that was the rule. So it just took forever to transcribe this. So I just made sure I transcribed the stuff I missed, and I transcribed the forensic evidence, and I transcribed all the, just made sure I'd taken notes during the trial, but I wanted to make sure I had everything really accurately. And then I had all this material, and I sort of had to sit down and sift through it, and I basically already had a structure, and it just took a very, very long time to do, because it was incredibly complicated. And actually finding a narrative from amongst all of that was quite complicated, because hopefully I've written it so it seems seamless, and this happened and this happened and this happened. But actually that's kind of a construct. I had to sort of, a lot of things were happening all at the same time. Oh, yeah. And I had to choose where to put them and slot them in, and choose what to write where, and what it was really interesting as a writer to do all of that, to work out how to tell the story. And I wanted it to have quite a pace to it. Yeah. I wanted it to be a page turner, because again, the people I thought would, the people I envisaged reading this book would be people who didn't know anything about the subject. So I wasn't going to write a sort of textbook on these are the problems with missing and murdered women, and here are the statistics, and here, because I just didn't feel that would grab people's attention. I wanted people to be like, what happens? And as they're reading, they're learning, okay, oh my God, that goes on and that goes on. And so that
you did a great job of that, for sure, because especially from my perspective, absolutely. Because I didn't know, right? And I felt very compelled to continue. Like, I didn't even know, when I started reading it, I didn't even know the the verdict. I didn't know anything about the trial. I didn't know who was even accused.
Wow.
Nothing. So I came in totally blind.
How did that happen?
I don't... White privilege, probably, frankly. But no, honestly, I knew of the name, but as I'm reading it, I'm like, he's gonna get the book thrown at him, right? He has to. I'm like, but then in the back of my brain, I'm like, I don't think so. Something's not gonna work. It's not gonna land. But yeah, somehow I managed to not know it until I read it. So you did a great job of at least keeping me engaged. So if I'm
absolutely, my wife too. She was reading it beside me. I was watching TV or something. And she was reading it, and she goes, "Get out of here!" I was like, "What?" She's like, "The guy was acquitted after all." I was like, "No way, seriously!" Like she audibly out loud like gasped at it. So he did a fantastic job.
Oh, that makes me feel great as a writer. I have to say that, like, kept my audience. That's good.
No, it's amazing. I mean, with all your reporting, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want, but with all the in-depth stuff you did, you went through all of it. Do you think he was guilty?
Oh gosh, I mean, I only know as much as you know. I can think he is, and I can think he isn't. I can go either way on it. And the court found him not guilty.
Sure.
And on the evidence presented. I mean, sometimes I think about that duvet, and I think, that could have gone differently.
Yeah.
But he always insisted on his innocence, and still to this day insists on his innocence. But then on the other hand, he had a very strong interest in Tina. So there was a point when I was writing, and it was probably about this time of the year, actually, 2 years ago, when I was writing. I got to sort of the Cormier chapters, and I thought, I know, I'm going to take a break, and I'm going to read an FBI profiling book on serial killers. So, I don't know. So anyway, I read this book, and was sitting there making this list going, and basically Cormier ticked every box of this, a disorganized sex killer. And I started to feel quite sort of scared. I thought, my goodness, like maybe he did, maybe he's responsible. I don't know, but then you have to kind of take a step back from that and say that's just the theory. The evidence didn't support it. There wasn't the evidence to convict him.
Sure.
And maybe the evidence wasn't there because he's not guilty. I mean, it's really impossible for me to say. I can't
totally
say.
Fair.
And
no, I figured it wasn't it was an unfair question.
Maybe we will know at some point. And maybe there will be another trial, or hopefully we will know.
Who's to say? But no, that's totally reasonable, and that's a very, very eloquent answer to a terrible question.
Diplomatic answer.
Very good, very good. This is kind of about nothing, but I'm curious. There's such a desire from people, and I feel like perhaps women in general, that we kind of gravitate towards like true crime, and whether it's podcasts, novels, shows. Why do you think that is? If you have any theories on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's been discussed a lot here in the UK as well. Why is true crime so popular with women? And there's lots of different theories, but I think perhaps what I think is that we as women are aware of our vulnerability from a very young age. We're aware that if we're walking down a dark street, we're kind of hypervigilant for footsteps behind us. We take our keys out early. We pretend to be on the phone to people when we're not, just to kind of put someone off the scent. You grow up, as a teenager, you've already sort of embedded all these behaviors. So I think what true crime does, for women in particular, is gives a kind of space where we can sort of vent our scaredness and our vulnerability and explore it in a safe environment, so that we can, we can sort of relive these crimes from a distance. And in a way, we find it reassuring because we're learning something about it. And usually there's a guilty verdict, and it's sort of a reordering of the world at the end of it. So for me, I think in a way it's a sort of visceral experience for women who are so aware of their own vulnerability that they kind of are slightly attracted to stories where women are vulnerable.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And that was sort of the theory that I had thought, was that, you're kind of living vicariously through it in a way.
Yeah. It's easy to put yourself in those shoes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe have a different outcome or something. So, and also I think as humans, we quite like to be scared in a way. We like to explore that side of things. I think it's important to us, for us to sort of understand and make sense of our world, to do that.
It's true.
For sure.
Yeah, and again, it's another thing that we as, straight white guys, we don't typically have to think about. And even we were watching recently it was a documentary on a murder in, I want to say Colorado or something. I think it's called like American Killer or something. Basically a guy.
Oh, I think I've seen that. Yes.
Yeah, where he
about
killed his
the
wife
housewife and the
kids.
2 children.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, that's
Right.
chilling. Yeah.
Oh, it was. But frankly, I didn't really like the documentary so much because it felt like you sort of already knew from the beginning kind of what, I don't know. It didn't really take you on a
journey.
path. Yeah. But that being said, I think it was when we were watching that, my wife there was some comment or something that they had said that, I forget how they worded it, but something along those lines where most women feel this or feel worried in this situation or they react in this way. And she just kind of nodded and she said, yeah. And then I was like, oh, really? Like it just didn't, it's just one of those things that I'd never acknowledged. It's another thing that we need to work on as a society. But that being said,
women are really aware of their own vulnerability in a way that we don't really discuss that much, but we all, if you get a group of women in a room talking about how they protect themselves if they're walking out late at night, you'll hear the same sort of strategies come up. And it's something that we don't really discuss with each other, but we are kind of all aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it is what it is, right? I mean, I hope that we continue to progress, and I'm glad that I guess it's coming perhaps more mainstream or kind of bringing more awareness to it in a way. And if folks can get their, get kind of let out the pressure, let out the steam by watching true crime, then all the power to them. And I think your book probably works pretty well for that.
Yeah, and just keep talking about things because the more we talk about them, the more they get normalized, the more they get out there, and hopefully we can, find a lot of solutions to a lot of these issues.
For sure.
Yeah. Though having said all that about true crime, there's also a really strong feeling in the sort of true crime genre, and I also believe this, that you don't just want to have victims who are dead on a slab somewhere or, just sort of almost like entertainment victims to scare people.
Right.
Tina was a real person, and Tina deserves respect, and that's very important. And I think a lot of true crime writers do follow that sort of maxim in that they want it's about illuminating a particular subject matter or themes or problems within society, not just crime for the sake of entertainment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's a great thing to bring up because I think in a lot of ways, the creators don't respect the victims, and it just becomes kind of murder porn, or that type of thing where it's just sensationalized, and it's just you tend to focus more on the killer and less on the victim, and nobody cares, and no, that's a great point. And I totally agree. I think that's important to remember that these are people.
But then again, in this book, I also concentrated a lot on the killer, which I think is uncomfortable for some people, but. And this is something I find really interesting, and a massive difference between Canada and Britain, I think. And that is, any Brit that's read this book goes, what were the Canadian police doing? How is that even legal? Really? And any Canadian who's read it has just gone, yeah. I've thought. So for me, that whole project sticks. I really wanted to explore because I thought, wow, they're really sailing close to the wind here. This is way out there. But that's because we've had cases in Britain that have set law to say there's no way you can do that as a police force.
Right.
It's really illegal. And it's illegal in a lot of other countries as well. There's only a few countries where you can do stuff like that.
Because of entrapment or whatever?
Sorry? Because
of entrapment, I guess?
Yeah, entrapment.
Yeah.
And leading on potential suspects. Yeah, so I found that quite fascinating, that side of the law, and spoke to a Canadian law professor about it actually when I was writing the book, and said to her, is there much of a debate around this? And she said, well, we're trying to make it a debate in Canada. We're trying to get people interested into looking at the ethics of this kind of thing. But I think that actually at the moment there isn't the public interest in changing it, because I think most people believe, well, look, if you get your guy why not?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, based on, again, our community, that would be exactly the thing. The ends justify the means, and that's not necessarily the case. That's interesting. I didn't realize that was. I mean, I guess I should have, but that's interesting. Were there any other? Now that you mention it, that's a kind of interesting question. Well, we can start petering it down soon, but were there any other, I guess, cultural or, I guess, national differences between people that read it in the UK, perhaps, and Canada, other than that? Kind of the different readership?
I think that was probably the main one. I think people in the UK had no idea of the situation, or even really knew about reserves, or even Winnipeg. Most people my friends who very kindly read the book have been like, wow, gosh. And I have to say to them, so it's near Fargo. That's the thing I always say. It's like 100 miles north of Fargo. Think Fargo, but Canadian. And we start there. And then,
wow.
So I think, it is really interesting. But then I had some friends in Australia read the book, and they really drew parallels with the situation with Aborigines in Australia,
right?
And mentioned some murders that had happened there and a similar sort of situation. So that was interesting. And I also think in New Zealand there are also some parallels as well.
Right. I do feel like Australia and Canada, because they seem to love Canadians over in Australia, that we do kind of share that similar parallel with the Indigenous people. And
yeah.
I blame Britain.
I think there's quite a friendship between Australia and Canada. But yes, it's done quite well in Australia. In that
it's the
sense.
Queen's fault. That's what it is. I blame her.
Blame the Queen, yeah.
Blame everything on the Queen. Yeah, so, while we're getting towards the end, I don't want to monopolize too much of your time, getting about an hour. Before we go, first of all, thank you for writing it. You did a great job.
Thank you
I enjoyed
it.
Yeah, 100%. I'll probably read it again multiple times. So, totally unrelated to any of this, how's COVID in the UK? Let's quickly touch on a little topical stuff.
Well, we're in lockdown, second lockdown, which is like lockdown 1 but more boring. We've all decided, but slightly different because the schools are back. It's kind of grim. It must be grim there too. I think you're also in a lockdown, aren't you? Up there.
Supposed to be.
Yeah.
Whether or not people are following it remains to be seen, but that seems to be the nature of the world. So
I think people have got lockdown fatigue, really, it's just something we're just going to have to get through it, aren't we? It's going to be a few more months before a vaccine can make an impact.
Hopefully,
for sure.
Hopefully.
Yeah, awesome. It's just life.
Is there anything you want to plug other than obviously the book? People go check it out. We're gonna tag I assume it's for sale on Amazon, all that.
Yes, it is. Okay. It's and everywhere in your wonderful is it Indigo?
Indigo and Chapters, yeah.
Indigo and Chapters, yes, and yes, it's available everywhere. That would be fantastic. If to thank you for publicizing my book. No, I had Winnipeg is now part of my life. I had a big experience working there and met some fabulous people and learned a lot. And there's a lot more to learn, really. But yes, completely by surprise. If you told me, a year before you'll be writing a book about Winnipeg, I would be like, who? What? Where is it?
Winnipeg?
And then you'd go, well, Fargo. So it came as a huge surprise to me to write the book, but I'm very, very glad I did. And I hope, I'm not an expert on Indigenous matters, but I do hope the book helps shine a light on a very dark and difficult situation and 100%. Help in a way, help understanding.
Couldn't agree more. And now
Absolutely.
You can go back home to the UK and other places in Europe and wow the locals by how cold it gets, and you can speak to Winnipeg winters and you can really
I tell people all the time about how cold it is in Winnipeg.
That's our claim to fame. And how big it is.
Yeah, you've been through the worst. You can survive anything now.
That's how I feel, yes.
Yeah, I have a couple of UK friends and my friend in Finland and stuff, and I like to just tell them how comparably tiny their countries are compared to us. So, anyway.
Thank you for reminding me.
But you have more people. So anyway, like I said, thank you again for writing it. Thank you for joining us. Folks, check out the book. Do you have social media you want to plug or websites or anything like that?
Oh gosh, I'm a bit slow at getting a website up. I'm on Twitter, quite, I guess. And but buy the book. That's the most important thing.
Perfect.
Red River Girl.
Couldn't agree more.
And thanks very much. This has been so much fun. Thank you.
Likewise. Yeah.
It's been good. If you ever find yourself around Winnipeg, hey, we got a studio waiting for you.
Okay. Next time I'm there.
So sometime in 2022, once COVID comes,
we're allowed to travel again.
Yes.
Yeah. Wonderful.
5
Okay,
years
great.
from now, yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Joanna. This was great. Hope you have a
It's
good day.
been awesome.
Great. Thanks very much, guys.
You
Have
bet.
a good
Cheers.
day. Have a good
Bye.
Sunday.
You too.
Bye-bye.
All right. So that was that. And I honestly can't stress enough, everybody should read this book, Red River Girl, Joanna Jolly. Amazing, amazing, amazing.
Get out there, give it a read. I mean, I'm glad it's out there and it can help, bring awareness to these issues and really honor the life of Tina Fontaine. And hopefully we can stop these things going forward. We all got to kind of try to be better as people and then help out with these issues where we can.
For sure. And like we mentioned before, as white folks, we need to use our privilege cards and wherever we can and spend them. And if we can use whatever we have to help move the needle, great. Definitely check out our previous episode with James Fable. It ties in really well with the story of Tina Fontaine and the work that he's doing in the community.
For sure.
I hope you enjoyed this one. It's especially interesting that someone from outside the country felt so passionate and inclined to come here to a place that most people in Europe and UK don't know about.
Well, and like we described, right? Like it's got the reputation. It's kind of dreary. It's just sort of a blah place in the middle of Canada, right?
Exactly, far from everywhere. But I don't know. I'm glad that she wrote it, and just her perspective as an outsider to still see it, what a lot of people here refuse to see.
Yeah.
It's important. It's pull the page back, pull the sheet back and examine ourselves, our country, our nation, our practices.
You got to make yourself a little bit uncomfortable to grow.
Yep. 100%. So definitely buy the book. We're going to at least tag the Amazon link, maybe the chapters one in the show notes as well, but give it a read. I own a copy, so I can lend it to you if you like, whoever
Absolutely. We have one here too, so if anyone wants to borrow it, just let me know.
Yep. We'll disinfect it for COVID, but
yeah.
Anyway, folks, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Please subscribe, follow, rate, review, all that stuff. We're continuing to make episodes even through a pandemic, lockdown, remotely. They're not all serious like this, but we got them coming down the pipe. Let's just say we're gonna keep rocking.
You know what to get with us. You get a mix of serious, you get a bit of goofy. You get a little bit of everything here.
Yep. We don't. We refuse to be put in a box.
Can't back baby into a corner.
Exactly. Anyway, folks, follow us on Instagram at 2 Idiots Podcast, on Facebook, 2 Idiots Podcast, on Twitter, 2 Idiots Show, and on YouTube, search for the 2 Idiots Podcast.
And by email, doubleidiotspodcast@gmail.com. Send us your thoughts, ideas, remarks, questions. Just say hi.
Yep.
And you can also now find us at patreon.com/2idiotspodcast, where you can come and show us some support if you'd like. If you like what you hear and you want to throw a couple shekels our way, that'd be much appreciated. We're going to be looking at using some of that money to get some new equipment going, kind of make the experience better for everybody.
For sure. So please, hope you all have a safe and happy day if you're listening, night when you're listening, whatever. Hope you're enjoying life. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. Please
stay safe, wear your masks.
Yep. Keep fit, have fun. Peace out.
Bye.
Bye.